Well, let's start with the first topic that we've talked about a good bit, but I want to throw it out to our panelists, and that's the subject of regulation. You all come from slightly different perspectives, and we've heard from the energy standpoint, the international standpoint, ownership, manufacturing, slightly different perspectives, but we'd be interested in knowing what regulations, what policies do you see as the biggest obstacle to your success in the U.S.? And Mark, if you want to start out with this.
Sure, Luther. I'll start us off. I won't go through all, we've talked a lot about it. I would broadly just call it federal environmental mandates, okay?
Gotcha.
There's a bunch of them, and we're regulated by them. You have a lot of the same regulation. That's the reason we appreciate what the Attorney General's office does so much. You know, the typical process, the regulations proposed, we weigh in, we try to affect the regulation. We're rarely successful. It then goes to be passed, and then we're in a fight that's protracted. What we've seen some of the regulatory agencies do is really unfortunate. They will pass the rule, and even if it's being challenged, you will have to comply. And we've actually had some regulations ultimately stricken down, although we've already had to comply with the rule by the time the court gets to act on it. Those are some of the challenges we face. For us, we've spent about $4 billion over the past decade, 15 years, to comply with federal environmental mandates. We're currently spending, I think, about another $1 billion for the regulations that are out there now. That's before we get to the Clean Power Plan and some of those. What's the impact of that on all of you? Your residential electric bill, about 10 to 15% of what we charge is directly attributable to these federal mandates.
Yep. Wow. Craig?
Well, I guess from forest landowners' standpoint, when I consider the question of, you know, what regulations out of D.C. causes concern, it's a little bit like the mosquito at the nudist colony. You know what to do, but you don't know where to start. I guess maybe one particular thing that's on the forefront would just be around taxes. You know, certainly our federal government seems to have a voracious appetite for revenues, and there's been a good bit of conversation on the Hill the last couple of years around comprehensive tax reform. You know, the concern is with one piece of legislation we could radically change the profitability of our businesses. And as forest landowners, these long time horizons that it takes for us to invest, finally get to a crop and then find out that no longer is it treated as capital gains, or the expenses that are required that you make every year for 10, 20, 30 years no longer have any tax advantages. Another concern is that relative to all the other industries, we're still relatively small, so we got to have one voice. We got to speak together and be smart about the way we approach this in the years to come. So, as a specific thing, it's that. Maybe a greater concern should just be the ongoing creep of regulations, because it's, you know, it's the classic frog in the pot. You know, it's just the accumulation, a little here and a little there, that erode our competitiveness and restrict our ability to create value from the forest. But maybe near-term taxes.
Got it. Jim?
Well, we've all been blessed to be born into one of the greatest places on the planet, and we have a government, we have a constitution, and we have a process that's, I think, better than any place else. But it's getting in a little on the heavy side. And we're a global company, and we work in many countries, and most countries of the world have developed regulations and environmental standards and processes to govern the things that we need to do as a society here and there. But it's clear that the United States of America has more regulation, has more granular enforcement of those regulations than anywhere else in the world. So it does challenge the competitiveness of the U.S. Industry. So far, we're holding our own, but it's a challenge. I mean, you think of the Boiler Act regulations. Our company spent north of $100 million upgrading our boilers, and understand that
being played off.
D.C. courts have just come down with the third iteration of the Boiler MAC regulations that we're all going to have to learn about what that means, and so it's a challenge. So we support good government. We support legislation that helps to make sure that we all do the right thing, but we think there should just be a little bit less.
Yeah. Ted, you might comment on the contrast between the U.S. and Canadian environmental climate.
Well, yeah, well, first of all, we have 3 downs in football in Canada. You have 4 down here, so we can, you know. I like American football a lot better, just so you know. You know, I'd say a couple of things. First, I agree with everything the other gentleman has said. I think one thing that surprised me down here is it takes a long time to get a permit when you want to do a capital investment. I mean, Alabama is one of the better places, but much slower in the U.S. than I find it in Canada, which kind of strikes me as kind of counterintuitive when I think about, you know, such a free enterprise environment in the U.S. compared to Canada. So that would be one. 2, lots of uncertainty. You mentioned Boiler MAC. I won't get into that. Lots of uncertainty, and uncertainty is not great for investment. But I've got to tell you one area, and I'm going to just challenge everybody. It's kind of a common theme I've been saying. Is this is the 3rd largest state, I believe, in terms of forest products in the U.S. after Georgia and Oregon, something like that. Top 3 anyways. What are we doing here working with government to grow demand for lumber? We do a lot of that in Canada. We do it offshore, and we do it domestically, and we work with our provincial, what you would call your state governments, work really hard to grow demand for lumber, changing building codes and pushing for that because it's in everybody's best interest. So I would challenge you for that. One thing I do want to say though is I was able to go to the dinner last night as well, and and you know, obviously talking to our folks, but the relationship that you have here between industry and government, you should be very proud of it and don't let go of it. And again, we're small. We want to be a small part of it, but I really would like to encourage this state to take a leading role in developing demand for lumber in the U.S. It'd be great for all of us.
I'm glad to see production moving to the south. I'm very sorry about the pine beetle situation. That would be a subject for a whole nother panel discussion, but we've witnessed that problem, which is very significant. Well, let me shift now to economic conditions and get your perspectives on that. And let me start with you, Craig, on this question. Prices have fallen going back to 2007. They haven't rebounded perhaps as much as people would have hoped. What's your forecast there? What are the factors involved in that?
Well, the good book teaches us that tribulation worketh patience. So we ought to have a lot of patience in our industry by now. We certainly had plenty of tribulation, but that is my counsel, that if we look at markets and pricing for our logs here in the U.S. South, that I do believe it's a matter of when, not if, we'll see price recovery. You know, certainly we've seen housing bounce back from 500,000 starts to 1.1, 1.2 million starts. We've seen increased demand for logs as some of the shift that Ted's shown us from Canada has been occurring. By our reckoning, over the last 5 years, we've seen capacity or demand increases of about 30 million tons in the U.S. South for pulpwood and logs, restarts of idled capacity, expansions of existing facilities, new mills announced. So there's a lot positive, but in the last 5 or 6 years, forest landowners have behaved rationally with prices declining by reducing harvest. So we've been in a period of sawtimber inventory accumulation. We've got to work through that. It's still going to take a few years. I think as we've seen prices improve, there's been supply response to price. More wood's been moving into the market, so we see prices go sideways until that's absorbed. We've got 2 or 3 years, we believe, left of that to occur, but long term, some real positives. Ted's told a lot of the story. Again, as we look at increasing housing starts, lumber demand, more and more of that wood will be produced here in the U.S. South. West Fraser, Canfor, Interfor have probably spent $1 billion in the last 3 or 4 years acquiring assets in the U.S. South. Typically, they do put capital into those mills. We're very pleased to have them as customers. So, you know, long term, we think there are really good prospects for forest landowners in the South. I guess since I'm not part of a public company, I've got more freedom to say what I might think about things. I think it's probably going to be another 3 years before we approach what the pricing that we saw before the collapse, and that would assume some continuation of recovery. But long term, be patient. We have all the things in place for great markets, a great resource here in the U.S. South, and we'll be rewarded for that patience if we remain so.
That's good. That's encouraging. Jim, you might comment on the global market and demand. You mentioned India, which I thought was very fascinating that you're significantly involved there. What do you see as a global demand for the forest industry products?
Well, certainly, as we think of the grades of paper that supply the world with the commodities we need, principally North America, of course, the communications papers have been on a rapid decline, and we've all seen the negative impact on that, on the mills, both Big Mill in Alabama and many other places that have impacted the U.S. Industry. Packaging grades, however, U.S. have been on the lift, and they continue to do so, and that really is the trend globally. As we think about the world becoming more wealthy, if you will, and the per capita consumption across the planet increasing, all of that wealth touches products that at some point goes into a fiber-based packaging. So we see demand growing at a 2, 3, 4%, frankly some economies 5, 6%, which is positive. On the other hand, as we think of being competitive globally, the U.S. supplier, companies like ours, that have a very strong capability to produce products, when you try to compete and sell globally, the currency is a big deal. And we've seen relative implosion of the economies in Brazil, which has caused the U.S. dollar and real separate to levels that make the U.S. just uncompetitive against the Brazilian paper that could be sold to the world. Similarly, Russia. Everybody knows Russia's got a lot of trees, but as we've competed globally for the last decade or two, Russia really didn't show up. I mean, they supplied their local needs within Russia. With the economy in the state that it's in Russia, they don't use the products that they produce there to the extent they should. And so now those are available to the global market at a very depressed price. So long answer to demand solid, but the relative competitiveness of the U.S. Products that we sell internationally are greatly impacted by the very low prices from Russia and Brazil, which trickles across the whole global supply chain.
Well, that leads to my next question for you, Ted, about, you mentioned that you export a tremendous amount of lumber to China. That was interesting to me. How does that factor into your thinking about international growth?
Well, I think, again, maybe to give you some perspective, I started going to China in 1988. I was selling pulp there before China opened up, and they were buying 300,000 tons of pulp, 1% of global demand, 1%. Today they're buying about 18 million tons, about 35% of global demand. So that's in 28 years. That's pretty significant. That's what is that? That's a 50-fold, over a 60-fold increase. I don't think we're going to see that in lumber. You know, we started at 0, and Russia is a factor. It's kind of tempered the growth in our demand. And, you know, they're taking about, 25% of British Columbia. It's mostly coming from British Columbia because we're freight logical to China. We continue to see growth there. You know, China, it's a bumpy road in China. I saw it in the pulp business. You see it in the packaging business. We're going to see it in the lumber business. You know, the question in my mind is, and China's demand for lumber continues to grow. I mean, their resources of softwood fiber are not that great, and so, you know, they're importing logs and lumber from around the world, and so how do we compete in that? And I think, you know, Jim covered that around currencies. I look at that from a short-term basis as a bit of an issue, but, you know, longer term, we have 2 fellows in Russia right now taking a look at things, just not to invest, just to see what they look like as competition. And, you know, between the 5.5-hour bus ride where they almost got killed, and the 1940 airport and the old plane and the infrastructure they see there. They got a resource there, but I don't expect it to grow tremendously over the next 10 years. So as demand in China continues to grow and the standard of living goes up there, I expect that we're going to continue to see growing demand for lumber, and I think we can play a role there. And by the way, India is a market that we're now serving out of the U.S. South. So there's going to be more and more growth in Asia. It's just, I think it won't happen to the same quickness as it did for pulp or for packaging grades. But no, I think it's an important part of our future for sure.
That's very interesting. Mark, you might comment. Talking about forest products slowly recovering and now starting to ramp up. How would you compare some of the growth in other segments of our economy here in Alabama? That's really of interest to our group here.
Sure. Well, it's been slow, and it's really been uneven in Alabama. So it's no surprise probably to anyone that the coal industry is really suffering right now. So coal is very depressed. Steel has been depressed right now, and that's in large part because of drilling for oil and natural gas is down. So all these things are intertied together. Probably one of the brighter spots we have in Alabama is the automotive industry. It has been one of our prime economic engines in the state for several years now, and it continues to grow fairly substantially.
All right, well, thank you, Mark. Let's turn now to growth and consolidation in this industry. And Jim, I think you're probably the person to take this question because of all the consolidation you've seen in your company. What's driving that in domestically and internationally in the industry?
Well, I can just speak for ourselves as a public company. I won't try to comment on others' strategy, but we're very bullish on fiber-based packaging. As I shared earlier, we see a product, a portfolio of products that really the world needs. We've seen U.S. demand for packaging 1, 2, 3% for 50 years, as I said, and we're seeing that same thing globally. We've been able to create a strong balance sheet and strong cash flow, and we need to invest that cash flow. We really have choices what to do with it. We give back to the shareholders in the form of a dividend. We can buy our stock back, or we can invest it in new assets, and we've chosen to invest in new assets, and those assets that we believe are the most successful for our company are additional fiber-based packaging resources. So I think that concept is it's clearly what's driven our company, and it's not about getting bigger. It is about getting better, and so we're selective as to those assets or entities that we acquire, but you will see us continue to grow in this space, and that is what brings about consolidation.
And Ted, I take it your philosophy is still the same: be conservative and be ready to consolidate or grow as you see opportunity?
Well, we've only bought 2 sawmills in the U.S. in the last 10 years. I mean, we bought 2 in Arkansas in 2013, 2014. We see more consolidation, but I think a lot of it's behind us, and it really comes down to, it's more of a generational thing. As owners, if they don't have succession in their family, they may look to sell. Mm-hmm. But other than that, we don't see it. And the other thing I want to say about consolidation is, I think the industry's shifting gears versus 25 years ago. Everybody wanted to be in everything. If you look at International Paper, they were into everything. Our company, we used to be in containerboard in a small way. We used to be in other things in a small way. I think you've got to, if you want to be great at something, you've got to have operational excellence. And if you put a new planer in one mill and it works well, we can put it in 28. So we really do believe that to compete in a global marketplace, you have to do what companies like Westrock have done and what RMS have done and what we're trying to do in lumber. And I think you've got to kind of pick your business and get really good at it, and that's where you're going to grow. I don't see us, a lot of us, doing other things, and I think that will be kind of the limiting factor to growth, and we'll see what happens once we run out of places to grow in the lumber business. You get forced to look in other places, and that's where companies get in trouble. So we're going to stick to our knitting, and if we see great opportunities and people want to work with us, we'll grow, and if we don't, we might have to give it back to our shareholders. And we're actually buying back our shares right now because I guess I can say this because we're doing it. We think we're undervalued, and we think our industry is undervalued, so we're buying back our shares. So that's one of the things we're doing.
Oh, that's good. Craig, RMS has expanded from its roots here in the South and here in Alabama to international investments on a scale you described. How do you evaluate where to deploy investments in capital in international markets?
Well, still pretty simple. The fundamentals remain the same whether you're looking at Mississippi or Brazil or New Zealand. First off, we want to find places that have well-established, healthy markets. Without good markets for the trees we grow, as you all know, our timberland investments are not worth a lot. So we're looking at markets where you have a diversity of end users, so we're not concentrated on single product. Markets where we feel like there's an optimism around the future, that we see demand growth, and that can occur in a couple of ways, either through increases in per capita income, as you see in a lot of the emerging countries, but also, as Ted's alluded to, finding ways to grow demand in mature markets like the U.S. The story around wood use in 5- and 6-story buildings is a great one, and I'll echo Ted's challenge to Alabama that we find ways to encourage wood use. Little anecdote, I live in Tuscaloosa. We were driving home from church not long ago and passing what is now like a 6-story apartment complex to house all those students that Saban has brought in with the winning football team. And as we were driving by, my wife looked and noticed there was a tear running down my cheek, and she commented that it was a very moving sermon that morning. I said, well, yes, it was, honey, but look at that 6-story apartment complex built out of wood. That's the glorious thing. So things that we can do to grow markets, and obviously places where there's reasonable certainty around our ability to exercise economic rights of land or tree ownership. And that does vary place to place, and you need to make sure that that the returns you can generate are commensurate with the risk you see in different localities. Good, stable business environments like New Zealand, Australia, and the U.S. are highly valued challenges in these emerging countries.
You note that most of the countries that you mentioned are countries that are based on a rule of law and a predictable legal environment where you can enforce contracts and other things, which goes back to our theme about the Constitution. Well, Mark, I drafted this especially for you because this room is full of your potential customers, and including on this panel. So this is your opportunity to, since they've described other investments around the world, why Alabama is a place that you should invest your resources.
That's a very good question. Well, from a forestry standpoint, I think that we do have a lot of really good natural resources that give you the raw materials for your product. We have low operating costs, generally speaking. We've got a business-friendly government. We have the rule of law. We have the Port of Mobile, which is a great asset to us. But I would say above all else, we have got a real hunger in Alabama for growth. And I think it's a state that really wants to do more and is hungry for opportunity.
Well, I want to thank you and your company's for your company's leadership in the economic development world. It goes back generations, really, and it's made a huge impact in our state. Well, I think we have time for one more question to go through the panel, to be respectful of everyone's time. And we're going to turn now to technology and innovation. That's the lifeblood of any company. I'll just start with you, Jim. You've had a remarkable history in your industry of innovation. What new technologies and innovations are out there on the horizon for your industry?
Well, we live in the world of trying to find innovation. As I shared in my earlier remarks, it's easy to have products relegated to commodity, and as soon as you're a commodity, that's a pretty boring place to live, because that means everybody can do the same thing you can do, and so then it's just all about price. And that's exactly where we don't want to live. And so we put a lot of energy in our packaging business trying to really create solutions And that means having deep, rich insights into our customers' requirements and really understand those emerging challenges that they're facing in order to help them compete and win. So it's not about us trying to sell what we make. It's trying to understand what the unique needs of our Procter & Gamble's and the Unilevers and these big companies to help them to shift the demand curve to have them be more successful, profitable from a cost standpoint, or to sell more product. And so within that space of innovation to reduce cost, there's a tremendous quest to create innovative designs. It's using paper-making science to create stronger fiber-to-fiber bonding, using chemistry and or other mechanical means in order to create a stronger package per unit of basis weight. It's using science and predictive modeling to create packaging designs that are stronger per unit of basis weight. It's trying to understand the retailing insights, in other words, what's going on inside of the brain of each of us and the universe that is making choices that shapes the decision to buy this one versus that one. And that often manifests itself in terms of look and feel and color and graphics and trying to create products that excite the consumer, which pulls the products off the shelf and integrates with our packaging and integrates with all of our trees. So it's a process of trying to create solution differentiated products versus commoditized ones.
Mm. Ted, what excites you about innovation, potential new technologies?
Well, there's new technologies in how we're using wood. I just talked about that 18-story building. There's new technologies in terms of manufacturing wood, which we're all using continuous kilns, auto grading, and we're looking at the same things in sawmills. And then I think new technology is how it affects the products we're producing. We're producing bioproducts. We're now producing lignin-based products in our company that allow us to replace oil-based adhesives, those kinds of things. But what I'm excited about it is where we're going as an industry in terms of making the jobs way better for our employees. We are taking out manual labor. That's going to help us attract a higher skilled workforce, a more interested workforce. And ultimately, I would hope that before I retire, that we don't have people flipping boards all the time, because that's how people get hurt. So lots of opportunities for us as a company and as an industry working together from markets, how we produce our products and the new products we can produce.
Very good. Mark, what do you see in the future? I know renewables and other forms of technology that you are adopting. What's on the horizon for you? Well,
we're clearly changing our generation mix at Alabama Power and really across the country. So we used to have 23 coal-fired units, generating plants. Now we've got 10. And all that's happened just in the past few years. So we see the use of coal diminishing, the use of natural gas increasing substantially. Renewables will be part of the portfolio. We've actually, go back to a comment Ted had about, we've been co-firing biomass a long time. So we've done that. We've got a long history of that. Right now the hot thing is solar panels and solar facilities. Right. Our view on those is we're supportive of renewable resources if it's cost effective. So if that's the right thing to do from a cost perspective, we're all about it. If we can save our customers money, we want to do it. Some people want to have a renewable resource even if it's not cost effective. And we meet customers like that who may have some corporate mandate that they will have a certain amount of renewable resource. If that's what they want, then we will find a way to get it to them, but we'll ask them to find a way to pay for it themselves.
Yeah, that seems fair.
Yeah, we think so.
Craig, you want to finish up with any thoughts on emerging technology?
Maybe just a couple of points. One, I guess in the tree growing business, a lot of the things that we do in intensive management are reasonably well established, and a lot of the effort in the last several years has been around efficiency. A couple of areas I think for significant change going forward. One is the ability to acquire and process information on the resource. Just a shout out to Dina Lavalapati, and it looks like that the geospatial program at Auburn is going to be moving forward. We look at the acquisition of remote sensing information and using that in management. We're doing that today with satellite imagery that gives us information on nutrient condition of the plantations, guides our operational fertilization program. So I think there's a lot to do yet in that arena. And John Pate's here. We're believers in the value and the growth in applied genetics. You know, corn per acre corn yields have been going up every year for 100 years, and I think there's a lot we can do both in volume and quality of trees that we produce on our land. So still things to do.
Oh, I appreciate you mentioning our universities and our partnerships with industry and the universities that we have here in our state and surrounding states. They do such a great job, and they need and depend on support of business and industry. Well, this has been a fantastic panel. I want to thank our panelists for coming from far and wide to be here with us today and share their insights, and thank Chris and the association for allowing us to do this. Let's thank our panel.